I used to count the words, "I love you," 3 syllables that I believed were the measure of a man's affection. With every silence, I'd scan his face, waiting, expecting, craving that confirmation. But it never came, not once. No notes on my pillow, no drunk midnight confessions, just stillness. At first, it felt cold, like standing in front of someone who never lets you in. I remember thinking, how can someone hold me so close, yet never say the one thing every woman wants to hear? I tried to prompt him gently at first. "You never say it," I whispered one night, hoping he'd respond with words I could wrap around myself. He didn't flinch. He just looked at me with those quiet, steady eyes. "You already know," he said, and that was it. No dramatics, no follow-up, just a man so certain in his presence. It made my demand for proof feel almost childish. But that night I couldn't sleep. I was restless, replaying that moment like something had cracked open in me. The next morning, I watched him make coffee in silence. His movements were intentional, no wasted gestures, no idle chatter. He brought me a cup without asking how I take it. He already knew. He always noticed everything. Like how I can't sleep with socks on, how I hum when I read, how I freeze up when someone raises their voice. He never said much, but his attentiveness was a language of its own. And suddenly, I began to wonder, have I been listening to the wrong language all along? We're taught that love speaks, that it sings, writes, declares. But what if love doesn't speak? What if it watches over you quietly, steadies your hand in chaos, leaves space for you to grow even when it means standing apart? That was him. Never intruding, never pushing, but always there. I started noticing the subtle ways he chose me, walking on the street side, never letting my phone die, remembering every little thing I forgot. It wasn't loud, but it was relentless and real. There was a moment, I remember it clearly, when I broke down in front of him. No makeup, ugly tears. I said things I didn't mean, lashed out. I wanted him to react, to yell, to prove he cared. But he didn't. He just sat with me, present, unmoved, not distant, not cold, just grounded. Like a mountain that doesn't flinch in the storm. And in that silence, in that terrifying, comforting stillness, I felt something more powerful than "I love you." I felt safe. I felt known. I felt loved. In the days that followed, I became obsessed with decoding him. I watched other couples, how easily the words flowed between them. Public displays, grand gestures, constant affirmations. I envied that simplicity. I wondered if I was settling for less, mistaking quietness for depth. But deep down, I knew the truth. He wasn't emotionally unavailable. He was emotionally precise. He didn't throw words around like loose change. If he ever said "I love you," it would not be for comfort. It would be a vow. Still, there were moments when my insecurities screamed louder than reason. I'd pick fights just to feel him react. I needed fire, some kind of emotional earthquake, to feel reassured. But he remained calm, unshaken. Sometimes he'd walk away, not out of anger, but to give me space to hear myself. And in those silences, I started hearing something I'd never paid attention to before: the echo of my own neediness. I wasn't asking for love. I was begging for control. That realization hit hard. There was something unnerving about a man you couldn't emotionally manipulate. He wouldn't play along with my spirals, wouldn't mirror my volatility. At times, I mistook that for indifference. But he noticed everything. When I was quiet longer than usual, when my smile didn't reach my eyes, he never asked what's wrong. He'd just hand me tea before I could even speak. It was maddening at first, like arguing with water. But slowly, I began to crave that calm more than I craved chaos. I remember one evening when we were walking home. I slipped on the sidewalk and laughed at myself. Without a word, he pulled me closer to the inside of the street. That small movement shook me more than any poem could. It said, "I see you, I protect you always." And suddenly, all those moments I'd dismissed, him fixing my cabinet without being asked, checking my tires, waiting till I was inside before driving off, came flooding back. He loved me, just not in the way I was taught to recognize. I used to think love had to be loud. That passion meant fireworks, shouting, chasing. But with him, love was stillness, it was presence. He was never chasing me. He was always standing exactly where I could find him. If I slowed down, it was terrifying, that kind of love, because it didn't demand, it didn't beg. It just existed, anchored, whole, and the more I tried to shake it, the more I realized I was the one who needed to change how I measured love, not him. I started comparing him less and observing him more. He never interrupted, never rushed to fix things. When I vented about work or cried about things that didn't make sense, he didn't offer cliches or forced sympathy. He just listened, fully, silently, and with a depth that made me feel real. It was strange how his silence didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate. Like he wasn't trying to rescue me from my feelings, he was giving me space to understand them. And that, somehow, felt like respect. My friends didn't get it. He's too distant. They'd say he should be more expressive. I used to agree with them. But they're boyfriends. They said I love you every day, then ignored them at dinner. Mine barely said a word in public, but never once forgot my brother's surgery or the scent I wore the day we met. I realized then love isn't volume, it's memory, attention, the kind of noticing that doesn't ask for credit. And he remembered everything I never even said aloud. There was a night when I couldn't sleep. My thoughts racing, fears spiraling. I didn't say a word. I just stared at the ceiling, trying not to wake him. He reached out in the dark, pulled me closer without opening his eyes and whispered, "You're safe." Just that, 2 words. Quiet, simple, unscripted. I don't think he even remembered saying it. But I do, because in that moment, I didn't need declarations or diamonds. I needed exactly that, someone whose instinct was to protect, not perform. Sometimes I wanted him to be more romantic, to surprise me, to make some grand gesture just once. But his kind of romance didn't look like flowers or candlelit dinners. It looked like checking my car's oil, or texting home safe at 2 a.m., or placing my favorite book on my nightstand after I casually mentioned it weeks ago. His love wasn't performative, it was consistent. Predictable even, but not in a boring way. In a grounding, anchoring way, like a lighthouse that never moved, even when I drifted. One day I asked him, "Why don't you say you love me?" He paused, not uncomfortable, just intentional. "Because I show it," he said, and he meant it. No justifications, no apologies. That was his truth. And the more I sat with it, the more I realized I didn't want a man who said what I wanted to hear. I wanted a man who lived it, even when I wasn't watching. And that's exactly who he was. Steady, quiet, unapologetically real. A man whose love didn't need to be spoken to be felt. I didn't realize how much I tested him until I stopped. The emotional games, the pulling away, the silence, the overreactions, I used them like currency, trying to buy his attention, trying to feel power. But he never played. He never chased. When I pulled back, he gave me space. When I lashed out, he didn't retaliate. At first, I thought he didn't care. But now I see, he was holding the line not for me, but for himself. He knew his boundaries. And that's what made him unshakable. There was a time I tried to make him jealous. I flirted with someone in front of him, subtly, of course. Just enough to sting. He saw it. I know he did. But he didn't react. No accusations, no passive aggression. Just a shift in his eyes, kind of quiet disappointment that said more than anger ever could. That night, he didn't bring it up. He just distanced himself, calmly, and that distance burned. It made me realize I wasn't testing him, I was testing my own worth. And I failed. His lack of reaction was never weakness, it was restraint. That was the hardest lesson for me. I grew up thinking love had to be proven through conflict, through fighting for each other, through dramatic forgiveness. But he didn't fight like that. He didn't fight me. He fought for his peace, and in doing so, he taught me what real strength looks like. Not in the noise, but in the pause. Not in dominance, but in self-control. It was frustrating. It was humbling. It was exactly what I needed. There's a strange thing that happens when someone doesn't need you. You either feel unwanted or deeply free. With him, I felt both. Some days I wanted him to break, to need me out loud, but he never clung. He welcomed me when I came close, but never chased when I drifted. And in that, he left me no room to manipulate or control. I had to show up as I was or not at all. That's the kind of man who changes you not by force but by being immovable in who he is. Eventually, I stopped testing him. Not because I gave up, but because I finally understood. He wasn't ignoring me, he was teaching me. Without words, without lectures, without demands, he was showing me that real love doesn't react to insecurity. It holds its ground. It invites you to rise, not pull you down to be reassured. That's when I knew the love I thought I wanted was loud, but the love I needed was quiet, and he was always there. Not to prove it, but to live it. I used to think silence was cold, that if someone really cared, they'd speak, explain, reassure. But his silence was different. It wasn't dismissive, it was deliberate. When I spiraled, he didn't interrupt. He didn't offer solutions, he just stayed. His stillness made space for my chaos to settle. It was unnerving at first. I mistook it for emotional distance. But over time, I realized silence was his way of not making my pain about him. He wasn't avoiding me, he was respecting me. One night, I told him something deeply personal, something I hadn't shared with anyone. I expected sympathy, words, maybe even advice. But he didn't say much. He just listened. His eyes didn't flinch. His body didn't shift away. And when I was done, he just nodded and said, "Thank you for telling me." That was it. But it stayed with me, because in that moment I didn't feel pitied. I felt witnessed. He didn't try to fix me. He simply stood beside me. That kind of presence is rare. There were moments when I wanted him to lose control, to raise his voice, to prove that I mattered enough to shake him. But he never gave me that satisfaction. Instead, he gave me stability. I didn't see it then, but now I know his refusal to react was a choice. He didn't let emotions run wild, not because he lacked them, but because he honored them. He knew that real love isn't chaos, it's discipline. And love without control isn't passion, it's volatility. Sometimes I think about the things he didn't say, the fights he didn't start, the accusations he never threw. He could have shamed me, guilted me, made me feel small, but he never did. His silence wasn't about power, it was about protection. He knew words can't be unsaid, and he valued the peace between us more than the thrill of being right. That kind of restraint, it's not just love, it's wisdom. And it taught me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is say nothing at all. With him, silence became sacred. It wasn't the absence of love, it was the container that held it. We could sit for hours, saying nothing. No pressure to fill the air, no need to prove connection through constant noise. His energy was calm, grounded, certain. And slowly I began to match it. I stopped overshowering. I stopped filling every pause with insecurity. I learned to sit in the quiet with him and with myself. And in that quiet, I found the most unexpected thing, peace. There was a shift inside me I couldn't explain. Subtle at first, like a fog lifting. I stopped waiting for him to say, "I love you." I stopped replaying old conversations, hoping I missed a hidden sign. Instead, I started asking myself, why did I need the words so badly? What was I trying to fix inside me by forcing him to vocalize what he already lived? That question haunted me for days. And then it hit me, I wasn't looking for his love. I was looking for my own certainty. The truth is, I had equated love with reassurance. I thought if someone said it enough, I'd finally believe I was enough. But love from others can't fill the holes we refuse to face. He never tried to convince me I was worthy. He simply treated me as if I was, and let me decide whether I'd believe it. That was terrifying, because it meant I had to meet him at his level, and I wasn't sure I could. But I wanted to try. For the first time, not to please him, but to become someone I respected. I remember waking up one morning and realizing I didn't feel anxious. I wasn't reading into his tone. I wasn't measuring the space between us. I was just still, present. Like something in me had finally stopped clawing for control. He hadn't changed a bit, but I had. And that's when I knew he was never trying to change me. He was holding space for me to evolve. No pressure, no expectations, just presence. And somehow, that was the most loving thing anyone had ever done for me. I started showing up differently. Not with performance, but with presence. I no longer needed to provoke him to feel seen. I no longer feared his quiet. I embraced it. I started mirroring it. And in that reflection, I began to see a version of myself I hadn't known before, stronger, calmer, less reactive. I began to love the silence I used to resent. Not because it changed, but because I did. And maybe that's the secret no one tells you: the right person doesn't complete you. They challenge your chaos until you outgrow it. Looking back, I think he always knew that I needed to burn through the noise to find my center, that I had to unravel before I could rebuild. He never tried to rush that process, never tried to save me. He simply stayed. And in that, he became the mirror I didn't know I needed. Not the kind that flatters, but the kind that tells the truth. The kind that doesn't lie when you're messy. The kind that holds steady while you fall apart. And when you finally rise, you don't rise for him. You rise for you. He never needed me. That's what scared me most. There was no dependency in the way he loved. No emotional blackmail, no guilt. No, I can't live without you. He could live without me. That much was clear. But he chose not to. Every day, he chose me in the quietest ways, promises without possession. I used to confuse love with need. But his love wasn't about survival. It was about freedom. And in that freedom, I learned what it meant to be truly wanted, not because he had to, but because he simply did. I remember watching him one morning, reading, barefoot, coffee in hand, completely at peace in his own solitude. He didn't seek validation. He didn't need an audience. That kind of self-containment was magnetic. I couldn't look away. And that's when it dawned on me I was addicted to his independence. Not because he ignored me, but because he never leaned on me to complete him. Being around him didn't fill a void, it expanded mine. He made solitude look sacred. And I wanted to taste that kind of wholeness. There were days I tried to make myself indispensable. Cooking for him, fixing things he never asked me to fix, inserting myself into his routines. I wanted to matter in his world. But he didn't need a savior. He needed someone whole. Someone who could stand beside him, not collapse into him. And when I stopped trying to prove my value, he met me with quiet warmth, welcoming, not dependent. That changed everything. Because I realized I didn't have to earn his love. I just had to stop trying so hard to deserve it. It's strange, isn't it? How the person who doesn't cling is the one you can't let go of. His detachment wasn't coldness, it was clarity. He never blurred lines, never said what I wanted to hear just to keep me close. And in doing so, he gave me space to question my own intentions. Was I here because I loved him, or because I wanted to be needed? With him, I learned love is not ownership. It's not desperation. It's two full selves choosing to stay, without chains, without force, without fear. The day I stopped needing him to need me was the day I truly loved him. Without ego, without expectation. I stopped asking for the words, for the gestures, for the proof. I didn't need them anymore, because his love was in the consistency, in the boundaries, in the silence. It was in the fact that he never tried to fix me, never tried to keep me. He let me go every time I pulled away and trusted I'd return if I truly wanted to. That trust, it broke me, and then it rebuilt me. Quietly, completely. There was a moment, I think about it often, when I looked at him and saw myself clearly for the first time. Not through his words, because there were none. Not through his actions, but through his energy. His steadiness reflected everything I wasn't yet: calm, whole, unbothered by validation. I had spent so long trying to be loved in ways I understood. I never stopped to ask if I was worthy of the kind of love I didn't. Being with him didn't make me feel more. It made me realize how much noise I was carrying. I began noticing the way I spoke. How often I filled silence with apologies, over explanations, little reassurances. He didn't interrupt. He just let me hear myself. And it was in that echo I started catching my own patterns, how I needed to be seen, praised, approved. He never gave me that. Not because he was cruel, but because he wouldn't feed the part of me that still believed I wasn't enough without it. His restraint was his kindness. And through that, I started cutting the noise inside me down to the truth. He never tried to change me, but somehow I was changing. Not because he asked, because he didn't. He let me face myself. There was no reward for growth, no punishment for staying the same, just presence, consistent, unwavering. And in that space, I was forced to choose keep playing the role I thought women were supposed to play, needy, emotional, constantly performing, or rise into the woman I was becoming, the one who no longer needed chaos to feel alive. I started spending more time alone. Not out of sadness, but serenity. I wasn't waiting for texts, overanalyzing silences, obsessing over what it means. I began journaling, meditating, walking without music. I craved the quiet he lived in so naturally. And the strangest thing happened. I began hearing myself more clearly. Not the version of me shaped by fear, but the one softened by presence. I had spent so much of my life trying to be chosen. Now I was learning how to choose myself. Eventually, I stopped chasing emotional highs. I didn't need to provoke him to feel alive. I didn't need tears to feel connected. His kind of love didn't burn, it warmed. Like sunlight through a window, steady and constant. And I realized something. He never stopped me from being emotional. He simply never indulged the drama. He left space for honesty, not spectacle. And once I stopped performing, what was left was something quieter, more sacred, and far more real than anything I'd ever felt before. My friends still don't understand him. They ask, does he even love you? Because he doesn't post, doesn't gush, doesn't play into the public rituals they're used to. They compare him to their boyfriends, grand gestures, loud affections, dramatic apologies, and I smile quietly, because what they see as indifference I now recognize as depth. He doesn't put on a show. He never needed the world to know how he felt, he only needed me to feel it, and I did. Every day, without a single announcement. They used to say, you deserve more, and in a way, they were right. I did deserve more, but not louder love, not performative love. I deserved the kind of love that wouldn't crumble under silence, the kind that held its shape when things got hard. And that's exactly what he gave me. He didn't try to win me back with gifts when I pulled away. He didn't beg. He just stayed the same, grounded, calm, consistent. And in a world full of noise, that stillness felt like a revolution. I watched my friends cry over men who said all the right things, only to betray them with their actions. I love you one night, ghosted the next. I used to envy those highs, that intensity. But now I see the cycle for what it was: addiction to volatility. What I had wasn't thrilling, it was steady, peaceful. And that peace, at first, felt boring, until I realized it wasn't boredom, it was safety. And most people are so used to chaos, they run from anything that doesn't hurt. Sometimes I wonder what they would say if they saw what I saw, the way he always notices when I'm cold before I say a word. How he stands on the outside of the sidewalk. The way he leaves space for my thoughts, never interrupting. How he doesn't try to fix me, just listens. They don't see that kind of love. Because it's not loud, it's not broadcasted, but it's real. And maybe the world has forgotten how to recognize something that doesn't beg for attention to prove its value. The truth is, most people wouldn't last a week with someone like him. He doesn't flatter, doesn't chase, doesn't fill silence just to ease your anxiety. He holds a mirror, and if you're not ready, that reflection will break you. He forces you to grow, not with words, but with how little he bends. And I used to think that made him distant, cold. But now I know it made him rare. And loving someone rare requires unlearning everything you thought love was supposed to look like. Being with him meant shedding layers I didn't know I wore. The need to be adored, to be reassured, to be constantly chosen. He didn't feed those parts of me, and at first I resented him for it. But now I see he wasn't withholding love. He was offering a new kind of love, one that didn't revolve around ego or emotional highs. He was giving me space to meet myself fully. And in doing so, he wasn't just loving me. He was inviting me to become someone capable of loving herself. His love felt like a quiet room after a storm. No apologies, no declarations, just calm. At first, I wanted more. I craved sparks, chaos, dramatic moments that looked like love in movies. But now I realize I didn't need fireworks. I needed grounding. I needed someone who wouldn't react to my storms but would stand firm through them. And that's what he was, my anchor. the steadiness I never knew I needed because I was too used to drowning in emotional noise. He never made me feel like I had to perform. With others, I was always curating my tone, my words, my appearance. But with him, I could be quiet, I could be still, I could just be. And he never looked away. He didn't flinch when I unraveled. He didn't fix me. He didn't even comment. He just stayed. That kind of presence isn't passive. It's active, powerful. He was fully there, even in silence, especially in silence. That's how I learned love doesn't always speak, it sees. I used to think being loved meant being constantly reminded. Compliments, texts, surprises. But his love didn't need reminders. It was embedded in how he moved through the world, with principle, with focus, with intention. He didn't just love me, he lived in a way that made space for love to grow. He chose his words carefully, kept his promises, protected my peace even when I didn't protect his. Loving him taught me real love doesn't decorate, it disciplines. Loving him wasn't easy. It stripped me bare. It forced me to face every part of myself I tried to hide behind validation. But it also healed me in ways I didn't know I needed. Not through comfort, but through clarity. Not through reassurance, but through reflection. He didn't rescue me. He held up a mirror and let me rescue myself. That's the thing about men like him. They don't love you with noise. They love you with stillness. And in that stillness, if you're willing, you'll finally hear yourself. He never sat me down to teach me anything. No long speeches, no lessons disguised as monologues. And yet, I learned more from his silence than I ever did from anyone else's words. The way he lived taught me everything. Discipline without rigidity, compassion without performance, presence without pressure. He didn't correct me, he embodied what I had to grow into. And maybe that's what the best kind of love does. It doesn't preach, it doesn't push. It simply exists so fully, it dares you to rise to meet it. There's something disorienting about realizing someone has been right without ever needing to prove it. He never said, "I told you so." He never gloated when I came back after pushing him away. He never demanded recognition. And somehow, that made his presence louder. There's a kind of wisdom in men like him that doesn't need validation. It doesn't seek to be admired. It just is. And standing next to that kind of calm, I had two choices: resent it or evolve with it. I chose the second. With him, I learned that control was not love. That giving space was not indifference. That silence could be the most honest kind of communication. I started applying what I learned from him to everything: the way I worked, the way I responded to conflict, the way I held space for others. I became slower to speak, quicker to observe. I stopped over-explaining myself to be understood, and somehow, the less I tried to prove who I was, the more I became someone worth listening to. He taught me that real power doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't need applause. It doesn't chase, it simply knows. And being around someone like that, day after day, reshaped the way I carried myself. I stopped entering rooms looking to be noticed. I started entering them already knowing I belonged. His example gave me permission to stop performing, to stop overextending, to stop confusing chaos with connection. What he gave me wasn't just love, it was blueprint, quiet, steady, unshakable. Sometimes I wonder if he knew, if he was aware of the transformation happening inside me, how his presence was undoing years of noise and fear and needing to be enough. He never asked. He never sought credit, but maybe that's the point. Stoic men don't love you to change you. They love you as they are, and in doing so, they give you the space to become what you were always capable of being. Without force, without praise, just quiet strength, and the invitation to rise. If I could go back, I wouldn't change a thing. Not the silence, not the longing, not the moments I begged for words he never gave. Because now I understand his love was never about performance, it was presence. And presence leaves no room for pretending. It forces you to feel, to reflect, to grow. I used to think I needed to hear "I love you" to feel safe. But with him, I discovered something deeper, a safety that wasn't spoken, but embodied. And once you've felt that, nothing else compares. I know now why he never said it. Not because he didn't feel it, but because he lived it. In his consistency, in his restraint, in his unwavering clarity. Those 3 words would have cheapened the weight of his actions. He didn't need to say it because I already knew. And that knowing, quiet, stable, irreversible, is the kind of love that lingers, that stays long after the person is gone. It doesn't echo in your ears, it echoes in your spine, in the way you carry yourself differently, because you were once deeply seen. Most people will never understand this kind of love. They'll chase noise, they'll chase highs, they'll mistake attention for affection, chaos for passion. But not me, not anymore. I've loved a man who never said the words, but gave me everything those words were supposed to mean. And now, when someone asks what love feels like, I don't describe butterflies or sparks. I describe silence, stillness. A man who never chased me, but never moved when I came closer. A man who made space and held it. Sometimes I still crave the words. Sometimes I still want to go back to that younger version of myself and whisper, "He loves you." He just says it differently. But then I remember she needed to learn it the hard way. She needed to unlearn the storybook love to recognize the real thing. And maybe that's the gift he gave me most of all. Not comfort, not clarity, but the chance to confront my own noise and choose something deeper, something quieter, something real. So no, he never said "I love you," and yet I have never felt more loved. Because love isn't always in the words. Sometimes it's in the silence that doesn't abandon you, in the boundaries that protect you, in the steadiness that holds you without needing to grip. If I ever love again, I'll love like that, quietly, deeply, without needing to be heard, only felt. And if I never love again, I'll still carry him with me, not as a memory, but as proof that even silence, when true, can echo forever.